Strange knocks in the night, furniture sliding across the floor, and voices that seem to come from nowhere. This isn't a horror movie. It actually happened inside a family home. Before we dive into the story, let me know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story is reaching. In the late summer of 1977, attention in Enfield, North London, began to focus on a council house at 284 Green Street. What became widely known as the Enfield case would, over the next 2 years, draw in police officers, reporters, photographers, researchers, and skeptics. The story has since been told and retold, but beneath dramatizations there remains a body of verifiable records. Police statements, press photographs, interviews conducted by established media outlets, and the testimony of the individuals directly involved. The household at the center was that of Peggy Hodgson and her children. Reports of disturbances led to a police call-out on September 1, 1977. One of the officers who attended, Woman Police Constable Carolyn Heaps, produced a written statement. In it, she described seeing a chair move a short distance across the floor without any apparent external cause. That statement survives in the Society for Psychical Research archives and has been reprinted in their Encyclopedia of Case Material. It is one of the earliest documented records from an official agency. Soon after, journalists from the Daily Mirror were assigned to investigate. Reporter Douglas Bence and photographer Graham Morris made repeated visits to the address. Their names and roles appear not only in the newspaper's coverage at the time, but also in later recollections they provided. Bence has published retrospectives of his experiences, while Morris has spoken on record in interviews with the BBC and The Independent. Both men described seeing objects move in the house, but Morris, as a press photographer, also produced images. He later explained to The Independent that while he captured dramatic moments, he personally believed some of the phenomena had ordinary explanations and that not all the photographs were conclusive evidence of anything unusual. Researchers associated with the Society for Psychical Research, most notably Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, also became heavily involved, spending long periods in the house. They gathered recordings and logs, though their methods and interpretations were later scrutinized by colleagues within the same organization, such as Anita Gregory and John Beloff. Skeptical investigators, including Joe Nickel writing for Skeptical Inquirer, later examined the photographs, audio recordings, and written accounts, offering mechanical or behavioral explanations. For example, photographs of one of the children apparently in midair were analyzed as showing a jump rather than a levitation. Nickel and other critics argued that tape recorder malfunctions were consistent with common mechanical issues rather than unexplained forces. By the time the BBC revisited the subject decades later, producing reunion programs that brought back participants such as Morris, the case had entered popular culture. But the broadcaster's programs also emphasized that the case record consisted of human testimony, a modest set of photographs, hours of tape recordings, and a handful of police and press documents. The BBC's interest, like that of the Daily Mirror before it, was in the impact the case had on those who witnessed events firsthand. All of these elements, police paperwork, press photographs, named eyewitness interviews, and skeptical reviews, form the factual bedrock of what is known. Beyond that bedrock lies interpretation, often colored by belief or disbelief. When compared directly, the documents sometimes diverge. The police statement about a chair contrasts with skeptical photographic analysis. Admissions by the children years later that they had occasionally staged incidents complicate the question of how much was deliberate and how much was misperceived. But the existence of the documents and testimonies themselves is not in dispute. They remain the traceable evidence of what took place in Enfield from 1977 to 1979. In late August of 1977, events at the council house in Enfield began attracting the kind of attention that turned an ordinary family into the focus of national reporting. The Hodgson household, consisting of Peggy and her 4 children, had already been known to neighbors and local authorities as a family under stress. What shifted was the series of phone calls and visits that began on the night of August 30th and continued into the following days. It was during this period that the first official records and independent witnesses entered the story, creating the timeline that allows the case to be traced with some precision. The earliest point of reference lies in the recollections given by Peggy Hodgson, who later told reporters that unusual disturbances in the children's rooms prompted her to seek outside help. That help initially came in the form of neighbors, who were among the first non-family witnesses to be told about objects moving and noises being heard inside 284 Green Street. These accounts spread quickly. Within 2 days, the situation escalated to the point where the police were called. On the night of September 1st, 1977, 2 officers attended, one of whom, Woman Police Constable Carolyn Heaps, later signed a statement. In that statement, which was preserved in the archives of the Society for Psychical Research, she described seeing a chair move a short distance without anyone touching it. She emphasized that she searched for wires or other means that might explain it but could not identify any. Although her report noted no crime had been committed, it gave the first official, dated, and signed document that referenced the household disturbances. What followed was a rapid involvement of the press. The Daily Mirror, a national tabloid, received word of the situation and assigned a team consisting of reporter Douglas Bentz and photographer Graham Morris. Their initial visit also fell within the first week of September 1977. Morris later recalled that during one of those early sessions in the house, he attempted to take photographs in a dimly lit bedroom when a heavy object struck him on the forehead. This incident became a detail repeated in multiple outlets, though Morris himself later downplayed its mystery, suggesting that objects were being thrown around and that not all of them required extraordinary explanations. Nonetheless, the photographs he produced, showing children apparently airborne or objects scattered across rooms, were published and widely circulated. The early weeks set the pattern that continued over the next 2 years. On the one hand, members of the Hodgson family and some visitors reported disturbances ranging from knocking sounds to objects moving. On the other hand, investigators, reporters, and skeptics attempted to verify or contextualize these claims. Researchers Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair of the Society for Psychical Research became principal recorders of the events. They began to spend nights in the house, logging noises and setting up tape recorders. Their involvement, starting in September 1977, created an extensive archive of tapes and notes. Yet even within the SPR, other researchers such as Anita Gregory expressed doubts about the reliability of what was being logged. This divergence illustrates that the chronology of the case is inseparable from the ongoing debate about how to interpret each incident. In mid-September, as the Mirror continued to publish photographs and reports, additional journalists visited the house. Local papers covered the family's claims, amplifying the story beyond Enfield. As publicity grew, so did the visits by interested outsiders. According to accounts from Morris and Bentz, it became increasingly difficult to control who had access to the property. The number of witnesses, neighbors, journalists, police, and researchers meant that the record of what occurred is not a single narrative, but a compilation of overlapping testimonies, some supporting each other, others contradicting. By late autumn of 1977, recordings of alleged voices and knocking sequences had entered the archive compiled by Gross and Playfair. These were later analyzed both by sympathetic colleagues and by critics such as Joe Nickel, who argued that the sounds matched known vocal techniques and equipment limitations. Photographs taken during this period showing a child seemingly propelled from a bed were also subjected to technical review. Critics noted the positioning of limbs and facial expressions resembled ordinary jumping. Supporters countered that the timing and frequency of the images suggested something more unusual. These disputes, though unresolved, are traceable to dated items of evidence created during that autumn. Throughout 1978 and into 1979, the case continued. The Hodgson family reported further incidents, and the Mirror occasionally revisited the story. Gross and Playfair maintained their logbooks, producing a volume of material later referenced in their own writings and in subsequent reviews. Skeptical assessments gained prominence as well, with magazines devoted to critical inquiry publishing detailed analyses of the physical evidence. In interviews given decades later, such as Graham Morris's discussion with The Independent in 2015 and with the BBC in 2018, participants continued to recall their experiences but often stressed the ambiguities and the likelihood that some incidents had been staged by the children. By the close of the 1970s, the chronology of the Enfield case contained a clear skeleton of documented milestones. The police call and report on September 1, 1977, the early Mirror visits that same week, the entrance of the SPR investigators in September and October, the accumulation of photographs and audio tapes through the winter, and the sustained but declining activity through 1978 and 1979. Later claims, admissions, and reinterpretations would all hang on this sequence, which is preserved in police paperwork, press photographs, published interviews, and archival recordings. Whatever conclusions are drawn about the causes, the factual outline of dates, visits, and documented material is firmly established. The physical record of the Enfield case is unusually large for a domestic disturbance of its kind, not because of the nature of the claims themselves, but because of the number of outside professionals who brought cameras, tape recorders, and notebooks into 284 Green Street. By the end of 1979, there existed hundreds of hours of audio recordings, dozens of photographs taken by professional press photographers, notes by journalists, police documentation, and artifacts such as damaged household items. Taken together, these materials formed a body of evidence that could be scrutinized by both supporters and skeptics, and which continues to be cited decades later. Among the earliest and most discussed elements of the record are the photographs taken by Daily Mirror photographer Graham Morris. Sent initially with reporter Douglas Bentz to cover the strange reports, Morris produced images that showed members of the Hodgson family, particularly the children, in what appeared to be moments of disturbance. One series captured 11-year-old Janet Hodgson in midair, seemingly leaping or being thrown from her bed. These photographs were first published in the Mirror and then widely reprinted in other newspapers and magazines. Morris himself later emphasized that as a press photographer he was there to record what was happening, not to interpret it. In interviews decades later with the BBC and The Independent, he expressed his personal view that some of the scenes were consistent with ordinary activity, such as children jumping on beds, but he acknowledged that the photographs had taken on a significance beyond what he originally expected. The photographs quickly became the most recognizable artifacts of the Enfield case. Skeptical analysts like Joe Nickell published critiques in Skeptical Inquirer, pointing out that the body positions, facial expressions, and trajectories in the images looked very similar to jumping or bouncing movements. In some images, arms were extended in ways that suggested voluntary propulsion. To Nickell and others, this indicated that what was captured on film was not levitation or being hurled by unseen forces, but rather ordinary playfulness timed to the camera's shutter. Supporters of the paranormal interpretation countered that the frequency and timing of the jumps seemed unlikely, but the fact that the photographs could be reinterpreted in purely physical terms meant they could not serve as conclusive proof of anything unusual. Audio recordings make up another major part of the physical record. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, who became the principal investigators attached to the household, brought tape recorders into the house and left them running for extended periods. Over time, they compiled hundreds of hours of reels. Among the most frequently cited sections are those in which a deep, gruff voice appears to issue from Janet Hodgson. This voice was recorded in multiple sessions, often in front of witnesses, and sometimes answered questions. To those present, it seemed surprising that a young girl could sustain such a sound. The recordings became widely discussed, with clips replayed on radio programs and in television documentaries. Skeptical analyses later suggested that the voice could have been produced by what is known as false vocal fold vibration, a technique that allows a speaker to create low, rough sounds. Critics pointed out that vocal coaches and ventriloquists had demonstrated the ability to replicate the sounds. Recordings also captured knocking sequences and other noises, though again skeptics argued that these could be created manually and did not necessarily require hidden machinery or trickery beyond what children might accomplish. Tape recorders themselves also became part of the debate. Gross and Playfair described incidents in which their recording devices malfunctioned, with tapes becoming tangled or stretched at moments coinciding with disturbances. Skeptics responded that reel-to-reel recorders of the period were prone to exactly those problems, especially after long hours of continuous use and repeated rewinding. Joe Nickell, in his technical review, emphasized that spool sticking, threading issues, and tape snarls were common mechanical failures. What for investigators in the house seemed to suggest interference, for critics was an expected breakdown of equipment under stress. In addition to photographs and tapes, there were numerous written logs. Gross, in particular, was meticulous in recording events in notebooks. His logs, later consulted by researchers and published in summary form, list times and descriptions of noises, object movements, and witness reactions. These logs serve as a chronological skeleton for many later reconstructions of the case. However, they are also subjective records, capturing what Gross noted in the moment rather than independently verified data. Other visitors, including fellow members of the Society for Psychical Research, sometimes left their own notes. Anita Gregory, for example, who visited the house, later criticized the methods of data collection, arguing that the children were not being controlled or tested in ways that could eliminate trickery. Another form of physical record came from the household itself. Objects reported to have been disturbed, furniture, toys, everyday items were sometimes inspected. The most famous early example was the chair observed by WPC Carolyn Heaps to move across the floor. In her official statement, she confirmed that she examined it for wires or trick devices and found none. That document remains part of the preserved record. However, because the chair was not removed for forensic analysis, and because the observation was brief, the incident cannot be examined beyond her testimony. Later, media organizations added to the archive. The BBC and independent broadcasters produced programs that included filmed footage of interviews inside the house. These recordings, preserved in broadcast libraries, show the Hodgson children recounting events and demonstrate the conditions of the house at the time. They also display the presence of journalists, photographers, and technical crews moving through the small rooms, a reminder that much of the physical record was created under the unusual circumstance of heavy media attention inside a private family home. Together, the photographs, tapes, written statements, and broadcast footage form a unique physical dossier. Each piece can be analyzed from different perspectives. Supporters highlight the volume of material and the number of independent witnesses, while skeptics emphasize the ordinary explanations consistent with the records. The photographs can be read as evidence of levitation or of children jumping. The tapes can be heard as voices from elsewhere or as vocal tricks. The equipment malfunctions can be signs of interference or simply machines breaking down. What unites them is that they all exist as tangible artifacts, created at a specific time and place, preserved by professionals as well as researchers. By the conclusion of the period in 1979, the Enfield case had generated more physical documentation than most household disturbances ever receive. It remains unusual not because of the content of the evidence, which is ambiguous, but because so many trained observers, from police to national press photographers, were on hand to create an enduring record. That record is what makes the case one of the most studied and debated of its kind in modern British history. The involvement of the police gave the Enfield case an unusual weight in the public mind. Most reports of disturbances in private homes attract only casual curiosity, but when uniformed officers are sent out, write statements, and later find themselves cited in newspapers and books, the incident enters an official domain. At 284 Green Street, the police were drawn in almost at once, and their presence forms one of the best documented aspects of the case. The first confirmed intervention came on the night of September 1, 1977. 2 officers responded to a call from Peggy Hodgson, who reported disturbances in her home. Among them was woman police constable Carolyn Heaps. What she described in her official report later became one of the most repeated details in accounts of the case. According to her signed statement, while in the house, she saw a chair move across the floor by several feet. She wrote that she examined it for wires or any hidden mechanisms but found none. She also noted that the movement occurred without anyone touching it. Her account emphasized that while no offense had been committed, she had witnessed the event directly. That document, archived by the Society for Psychical Research, remains one of the rare instances in which a serving police officer put on record an observation at the Enfield address. The report was of immediate interest to journalists. The fact that a police officer had written a statement about unexplained movement gave the story credibility in the eyes of the Daily Mirror team that arrived soon after. It also meant that from very early on, the Enfield case included a layer of official testimony not usually present in domestic incidents. For the Hodgson family, the visit brought outside validation that something unusual, at least in appearance, was occurring in their home. For skeptics later reviewing the file, it raised the question of how police officers, trained to observe, could have been convinced by what might have been ordinary movement caused by unseen pushes or vibrations. The police did not maintain a permanent presence at the house. Once their report was filed, responsibility shifted away from the Metropolitan Police. Officers who attended concluded that no criminal act had taken place, and there was therefore no further basis for police investigation. Nonetheless, the written record created a foundation on which subsequent visitors, journalists, researchers, skeptics, built their narratives. Whenever later reports were published, they almost always mentioned that a policewoman had witnessed a chair move. This gave the entire story an official stamp that many other claims of disturbances lacked. The engagement of law enforcement did not end there. In later months, officers were occasionally called back to the house when disturbances were reported as escalating. Accounts from the period mention visits by other officers, though without the same level of detailed documentation as Heaps's report. These later attendances are mentioned in contemporaneous press stories, which noted that police had responded but had not found evidence of crime. In some cases, officers advised the family to seek help from other agencies, but there is no evidence of an extended police inquiry beyond the initial statement. Within the Society for Psychical Research, the Heaps report was treated as a valuable artifact. Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, who spent many months in the house, pointed to it as evidence that independent witnesses, including officers trained to look for deception, had observed physical movement without explanation. To critics within the same organization, however, the statement was not enough. Anita Gregory, who reviewed the case, argued that even trained officers could be misled by rapid, low-light conditions in a tense atmosphere. She stressed that while the statement was genuine, it did not prove that the cause was beyond ordinary means. Skeptics outside the SPR, such as Joe Nickel, drew attention to the limits of police involvement. Nickel pointed out that while a chair may indeed have shifted, the absence of a visible cause did not mean the cause was extraordinary. He emphasized that once the police had determined there was no criminal activity, they withdrew. To him, this showed that even those who had been on the scene did not treat it as a matter requiring further official resources. The discrepancy between the police paperwork and the lack of subsequent police follow-up became a recurring theme. On one side were those who highlighted that an officer had written down her observation under her own name, an unusual step in such cases. On the other side were those who noted that no investigation followed, that the force treated the matter as closed, and that this in itself suggested the report was not considered indicative of criminal or public danger. In interviews decades later, when the BBC produced reunion programs on the Enfield case, the presence of the police in the story was still treated as significant. Participants recalled the importance of the Heap statement and the way it had been used in media reports. For the journalists who covered the events, it remained a crucial element in persuading editors that the story was worth printing. The police presence at Enfield was therefore brief but disproportionately influential. In practical terms, officers attended, observed, filed a statement, and left, with no ongoing involvement. In cultural terms, the fact that the uniformed police had been present at all was enough to give the story a seriousness that propelled it onto national front pages. That paradox, the brevity of the actual police role compared to the weight given to it in later retellings, is one of the central official discrepancies in the Enfield case. By the end of 1979, no further official reports had been filed, and the police role was complete. What remained were copies of the original paperwork, recollections of officers' brief visits, and the ways in which those documents were cited by investigators and journalists. The case thus stands as a rare example of how a single signed police report, observing an unexplained movement, can shape public perception for decades even in the absence of any follow-up investigation. The role of the media in the Enfield case was central, not only in shaping how the story was told at the time but also in determining how it would be remembered. From the first week of September 1977, journalists and photographers were inside 284 Green Street, their presence altering the atmosphere and producing the most widely circulated artifacts of the events. The house, small and ordinary in a North London suburb, became crowded with not just a family and researchers, but also reporters trying to capture usable material for a national audience. The Daily Mirror was the first major outlet to give sustained attention to the story. Reporter Douglas Bence and photographer Graham Morris were dispatched to the Hodgson home almost immediately after the police had filed their initial statement. Bence later wrote in retrospectives that he regarded the assignment as unusual from the start. A journalist used to covering political and social issues was now tasked with reporting on claims of moving furniture and unexplained sounds. His accounts provide detail about the conditions under which the press worked. Cramped bedrooms filled with children, anxious family members, and the constant expectation that something might happen at any moment. For Morris, the assignment produced some of the most famous photographs of his career. His images of Janet Hodgson, apparently airborne, became emblematic of the case. In later interviews with The Independent and the BBC, he explained that while he captured dramatic shots, he was personally skeptical about their interpretation. He described being struck by objects while trying to take pictures, a detail that gave the story human drama, but he later told interviewers that he thought ordinary explanations were likely for much of what occurred. Despite his skepticism, his photographs provided the images that editors needed to put the story onto front pages. The relationship between the press and the Hodgson family was not a simple one. On the one hand, the family benefited from the attention. Their claims were taken seriously enough to be printed in major newspapers, and the visits by journalists meant they were not facing events alone. On the other hand, the presence of cameras and reporters inevitably changed the dynamic inside the house. With outsiders constantly observing, the children were aware that their actions were being recorded. Later, some investigators would suggest that the press presence may have encouraged exaggeration or even fabrication. In this sense, the media were not neutral observers but participants who shaped the behavior they documented. The Mirror's coverage brought in other outlets. The BBC produced radio and television reports, with crews entering the house to interview the Hodgsons and film the environment. Broadcast footage from this period shows the children describing events in their own words. The presence of cameras in bedrooms and living rooms underlined how intrusive the coverage could be. The BBC, unlike the Mirror, had public service obligations, and its programs framed the story more cautiously. They presented interviews and material without drawing firm conclusions, but the effect was still to validate that the case was newsworthy. The sustained involvement of the media also had an effect on the investigators. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair of the Society for Psychical Research became well known in part because of their association with the widely covered Enfield story. Their logs and recordings gained attention because journalists referenced them. Without the Mirror and the BBC, the case might have remained a local curiosity. Instead, it became national news in large part because the media had compelling images, dramatic quotes, and official documents to reference. Access to the house was not always easy to manage. The Hodgsons at times struggled to control the number of people entering their home. Journalists, photographers, researchers, and curious neighbors could all be present. Morris later reflected on how chaotic the scene sometimes became, with too many outsiders competing to witness events. This lack of control raises questions about how spontaneous the disturbances were. With multiple people watching, any child could have performed actions that might be misinterpreted or missed in the moment but caught in a photograph. Critics later noted that the heavy media presence created incentives for dramatization. Professor Chris French, writing for Time Out, pointed out that the sisters admitted on occasion to staging incidents. In a house filled with journalists expecting something to happen, the pressure to produce might have been high. French argued that the admissions weakened the reliability of the entire record. At the same time, the media did preserve the story in ways that no private individual could have. The Mirror's negatives, the BBC's broadcast tapes, and the articles in print provide a public archive that can still be accessed and evaluated. Even if the material is ambiguous, its existence makes the Enfield case unusually well documented compared to other reports of disturbances. By the late 1970s, press interest began to fade, though anniversaries and later documentaries would bring it back. For a time, though, the Hodgson household was one of the most reported on addresses in Britain, with journalists filing daily notes, photographers setting up equipment in bedrooms, and television crews wiring up living rooms. This level of coverage turned what might have been an isolated family story into one of the most debated domestic cases of its era. The interaction between media, family, and investigators illustrates how each shaped the others. The family gave reporters the story. The reporters gave the family validation and attention. The investigators gained a platform through the coverage, and the media gained dramatic images and copy. The case's place in history is as much a product of that cycle as of the disturbances themselves. By the time the BBC revisited the story in 2018 with a reunion program, participants such as Graham Morris reflected on the unusual environment of those years. They emphasized how the presence of cameras, notebooks, and microphones created a feedback loop in which the search for stories sometimes blurred with the search for truth. The most sustained involvement at 284 Green Street came not from journalists or police but from investigators attached to the Society for Psychical Research, particularly Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair. Their role stretched across the longest period, beginning in September 1977 and lasting intermittently until the decline of activity in 1979. Through them, the Enfield case gained its most extensive body of notes, recordings, and published reflections, which would later be debated both within and outside the SPR. Maurice Grosse, an engineer by background, was drawn into the case soon after the initial reports. He began spending nights in the Hodgson home, observing the family and documenting what he heard and saw. His method involved maintaining detailed notebooks, setting up tape recorders to run for long periods, and marking down the times of reported disturbances. Over months, this created a large archive that became central to later reconstructions of the case. Grosse regarded himself as a careful witness rather than a detached experimenter, and his style of involvement was immersive. He lived with the family for stretches of time, becoming a trusted presence in the household. Guy Lyon Playfair, a journalist and writer with an interest in psychical research, joined the investigation soon after. He worked alongside Grosse and later published a book based on his experiences. Like Grosse, he logged events, made recordings, and tried to establish patterns in the disturbances. The two men often worked as a team, though their approaches had subtle differences. Playfair, with his journalistic background, sometimes emphasized narrative detail, while Grosse concentrated on cataloging specific incidents. The investigators' prolonged presence allowed them to gather material in volume rather than in isolated snapshots. They recorded hours of the so-called voices that appeared to come from Janet Hodgson. These voices, deep and harsh compared to her normal speech, could sustain conversations and were captured on tape while visitors listened. To the investigators, this seemed compelling, as it was unusual for a child to maintain such sounds for extended periods. They presented the recordings to colleagues and to the media, arguing that they were among the strongest evidence that something beyond trickery might be involved. Critics later suggested, however, that the voice was consistent with a vocal technique using the false vocal folds, and that it was not beyond the capacity of an imaginative child to produce. Grosse and Playfair also reported numerous physical disturbances. Objects thrown, furniture shifted, knocking sounds repeated in response to questions. They logged these in real time, noting the presence of witnesses. For them, the volume of such incidents, occurring night after night, was what set the case apart. They felt that a hoax could not be maintained at that level of frequency without detection. Their records reflect this view, emphasizing accumulation over single dramatic moments. Within the Society for Psychical Research, however, not all colleagues agreed with their interpretation. Anita Gregory, another SPR member who visited the house, was skeptical of the conditions under which evidence was gathered. She argued that the investigators were too close to the family, too willing to take testimony at face value, and not rigorous enough in controlling for trickery. John Beloff, another senior figure in the SPR, echoed concerns that the methods lacked scientific controls. These internal criticisms are important because they demonstrate that even within the same organization there was no consensus about how to read the material Grosse and Playfair collected. Outside the SPR, skeptics such as Joe Nickel took issue not only with the interpretations but also with the investigators' basic methodology. Nickel pointed out that children left unsupervised for even short periods could easily have created many of the recorded disturbances. He argued that photographs showing Janet airborne were more consistent with jumping, that audio malfunctions on tape machines were common, and that the voices could be produced naturally. His reviews in Skeptical Inquirer provided detailed alternative explanations, citing technical knowledge of photography, audio recording, and vocal mechanics. Despite the criticism, the archive left by Grosse and Playfair is unusually rich. Their tapes and notes, housed in private collections and the SPR archives, offer one of the most complete inside records of a supposed haunting in modern Britain. Even skeptics acknowledge that the sheer quantity of material is noteworthy, though they disagree with the interpretation. The logs list times, dates, and descriptions. The tapes preserve hours of household atmosphere. The investigators' correspondence shows how they communicated with colleagues and defended their work. Another feature of their involvement was their interaction with the press. Journalists frequently asked Gross and Playfair to provide access, explanations, or recordings. Their cooperation helped shape media coverage, while at the same time they used the press to underscore the seriousness of the case. This created a loop in which investigators and journalists reinforced each other, even as skeptical voices raised doubts. The relationship between the investigators and the Hodgson family was also complex. Gross in particular became a supportive presence, spending holidays and long nights with them. This closeness gave him access but also exposed him to criticism that he was no longer objective. Supporters saw his dedication as evidence of commitment, while critics argued that it blurred the line between observer and participant. By the time activity declined in 1979, Gross and Playfair had amassed a body of material that would feed books, articles, and documentaries for decades. Their published accounts presented the Enfield case as one of the most compelling modern examples of unexplained household disturbance. Yet the same material became the foundation for skeptical reassessment, with critics using the tapes, photographs, and logs to argue for ordinary explanations. Thus, the role of the investigators was pivotal. They were not neutral collectors of data in controlled conditions but active participants who lived in the house, befriended the family, and recorded what they saw. Their closeness allowed them to build the largest archive of any Enfield participant, but it also meant that their interpretations were inseparable from their personal commitment to the family. Within the wider SPR and in the skeptical literature, this tension remains one of the central issues in evaluating the Enfield record. As the Enfield disturbances unfolded and were documented by police, journalists, and Society for Psychical Research investigators, a parallel body of analysis began to grow among skeptics, technicians, and professional observers who were less persuaded by extraordinary explanations. This body of critical commentary formed a second track of interpretation. Rather than disputing whether photographs, tapes, or logs existed, skeptics focused on how to read them. Their work, published in established outlets such as Skeptical Inquirer and in interviews with mainstream media, became essential for anyone examining the Enfield case through a naturalistic lens. One of the earliest and most influential critical voices was Joe Nickell, an investigator with the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Drawing on expertise in photography, audio technology, and stage magic, Nickell examined the physical record of the Enfield case. In his reviews, he argued that the photographs of Janet Hodgson airborne could be accounted for by simple jumping. He noted the posture of her body, the extension of limbs, and facial expressions that suggested active propulsion rather than passive levitation. Nickell emphasized that in certain photographs, her feet and arms were positioned exactly as if she were leaping from the bed. For him, the images demonstrated nothing more unusual than children bouncing or playing. Nickell also tackled the issue of the audio tapes, particularly the recordings of the so-called voices. To investigators like Maurice Gross and Guy Lyon Playfair, the deep guttural tones coming from Janet seemed inexplicable for a child to sustain. To Nickell, however, they were consistent with known vocal techniques, specifically the use of false vocal folds. Singers, actors, and ventriloquists had long demonstrated the ability to produce rough, low voices by engaging different parts of the vocal apparatus. He cited demonstrations by vocal experts to show that children were capable of producing similar sounds, even for extended periods. Far from being proof of an external presence, the tapes were, in his view, evidence of a child experimenting with vocal tricks. Another skeptical focus was the malfunctioning of equipment. Gross and Playfair described how tape recorders in the house sometimes snarled or tangled during moments of disturbance. To them, this appeared to be part of the unexplained phenomena. To Nickell and other technical commentators, reel-to-reel recorders of the 1970s were prone to exactly such failures, particularly after long hours of use. Tape stretching, spooling errors, and threading issues were common and required constant maintenance. Far from demonstrating interference, the malfunctions were entirely consistent with the technology's limitations. Critics also addressed the credibility of the child witnesses. Over the years, both Janet and her sister Margaret admitted that at times they had faked events. In interviews, they explained that they sometimes staged incidents to test the investigators or because of the pressure to produce phenomena for the constant stream of visitors. Professor Chris French, writing in Time Out, emphasized that these admissions severely undermined the reliability of the case as a whole. If the children were willing to fabricate some incidents, it became difficult to separate genuine events from deliberate trickery. The skeptical literature also highlighted the role of expectation and suggestion. With journalists, photographers, and researchers crowded into the small house, the children were under constant observation. Critics argued that this environment created strong incentives for performance. A movement, a noise, or a playful jump could be interpreted by eager observers as extraordinary. The very presence of cameras and tape recorders could amplify ordinary activity into something that seemed anomalous. Magicians and illusionists also contributed analyses. Familiar with techniques of misdirection and deception, they argued that many of the recorded phenomena could be reproduced in controlled conditions. Throwing objects when attention was elsewhere, using concealed methods to create knocks, or jumping when cameras were ready. These were all within the capacity of children familiar with their own home environment. Nickel himself, trained in stage magic, stressed that once trickery is admitted in some cases, it must be considered possible in many. Skeptics were not dismissing the sincerity of all witnesses. They acknowledged that police officers, journalists, and neighbors genuinely believed they had seen unusual things. But they argued that belief and observation are not the same as proof. Intense, dimly lit, or crowded conditions, perceptions can be distorted. A chair sliding slightly could appear more dramatic than it was. A child jumping could look like levitation if caught at the right instant. Voices could sound uncanny when produced in unexpected ways. The critical literature also pointed to inconsistencies in the record. For example, while Gross and Playfair insisted that many disturbances occurred spontaneously, other visitors found the children eager to perform when attention was on them, but less convincing under controlled observation. Internal critiques within the Society for Psychical Research echoed this, with Anita Gregory stressing that the investigators were too close to the family and insufficiently rigorous in testing claims. Decades later, skeptical interpretations continued to dominate academic and journalistic reassessments. The independent interview with Graham Morris in 2015 underscored this perspective. While Morris had been in the house and taken the famous photographs, he himself believed that ordinary explanations could account for much of what he witnessed. He recalled being struck by objects and seeing dramatic movements, but concluded that many of the photographs, including the airborne images of Janet, showed nothing more unusual than a child jumping. The skeptical analyses are not simply counterclaims. They serve as a methodological framework. They show how ambiguous evidence, photographs, tapes, witness statements, can be interpreted in naturalistic ways. They stress that the burden of proof lies not in producing striking artifacts but in ruling out ordinary causes under controlled conditions. By that standard, they argue the Enfield case does not provide verifiable proof of anything beyond the ordinary. At the same time, the persistence of the skeptical literature demonstrates the unusual richness of the Enfield archive. Few domestic cases offer so much material to analyze. The photographs, tapes, and logs give skeptics more to work with than in most reports, which often rely only on anecdotal accounts. In this sense, the case remains important to skeptics not because it proves the extraordinary but because it illustrates how ordinary explanations can account for even the most widely publicized claims. By the end of the 1970s, then, two parallel records existed: the immersive logs and recordings compiled by Gross and Playfair, and the skeptical analyses published by Nickel, French, and others. Both relied on the same raw material: photographs, audio tapes, witness testimony, but interpreted it in fundamentally different ways. For investigators sympathetic to the family, the accumulation of events was persuasive. For skeptics, the same accumulation highlighted patterns of misinterpretation, hoaxing, and equipment failure. The skeptical track continues to shape the modern reception of the Enfield case. Documentaries and articles now almost always include reference to Nickel's critiques, the admissions by the Hodgson children, and the mechanical explanations for the tapes and photographs. The legacy of the skeptics is therefore inseparable from the legacy of the case itself, ensuring that the Enfield disturbances remain not just a story of unexplained events, but a case study in how evidence is contested, reinterpreted, and debated across decades. As the disturbances at 284 Green Street subsided toward the end of the 1970s, the story entered its second life, that of retrospective accounts, anniversary features, and documentary treatments that extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood of Enfield. By the early 1980s, the case was less about nightly incidents and more about how those incidents were remembered, debated, and represented to new audiences. This phase, media retrospection and later retellings, would prove decisive in cementing the Enfield Poltergeist in cultural memory, even as factual disputes and interpretive divisions persisted. When This Is Your Life-style television programming and retrospective features revisited the case, they often relied on the same handful of striking materials. Graham Morris's photographs of Janet apparently airborne, excerpts from Maurice Gross's tape recordings, and the police officer's written statement about seeing a chair move unaided. These items, circulated repeatedly, took on symbolic weight far beyond their original evidential value. To a viewing public encountering the case years later, they appeared as unassailable anchors in the story, even though skeptics had long argued for ordinary explanations. The repetition of images and clips helped transform the case from a local household drama into a national reference point. Print media played a similar role. Newspapers such as the Daily Mirror and the Daily Mail revisited the Hodgson family story at intervals, particularly on anniversaries or when new books or films renewed public interest. These articles often interviewed surviving participants, including Janet and Margaret as adults. Their recollections were inevitably colored by decades of distance. Janet, in particular, acknowledged in later interviews that she and her sister sometimes faked incidents, but she also maintained that much of what happened could not be explained away. This dual stance, admitting trickery while affirming mystery, was frequently presented in headlines that emphasized the persistence of belief despite acknowledged fabrication. Television documentaries in the 1990s and early 2000s drew on the SPR archives and press photographs. Programs often featured voiceover narration that framed the case as Britain's most famous haunting, while intercutting skeptical commentary. This dual presentation reflected the state of the debate. The case was too famous to be dismissed outright, yet too contested to be endorsed without caveat. Producers recognized that its enduring appeal lay precisely in its ambiguity. The BBC's 2018 reunion program offered a telling example of this retrospective mode. Bringing together photographer Graham Morris and surviving Hodgson family members, the broadcast allowed participants to reflect on events with the benefit of hindsight. Morris reiterated his skepticism about supernatural interpretations, stressing that he saw children jumping rather than levitating. Yet he also recalled the emotional intensity of being in the house, the tension of waiting for objects to move, and the sense of being part of something extraordinary in the social sense, if not the supernatural one. The Hodgson sisters, by then adults with families of their own, spoke about the impact of prolonged media and investigator attention during their adolescence, acknowledging both the trauma and the notoriety that shaped their later lives. Retrospectives also confronted the criticisms voiced by academics and skeptics. Publications such as Time Out and The Guardian revisited Professor Chris French's analyses, ensuring that new audiences were reminded of the admitted trickery and the weaknesses in the investigators' methods. In these later decades, it became almost obligatory for journalistic pieces to include both believer and skeptic voices, creating a standardized narrative format. Photographs and tapes on one side, vocal cord analysis and hoax admissions on the other. The very symmetry of this format helped perpetuate the case as unresolved, regardless of where one stood. Another layer of retrospection came through dramatizations. Plays, radio programs, and later television miniseries reimagined the Enfield events as drama rather than documentary. These productions often borrowed names, places, and images from the factual record, but rearranged them for narrative effect. While dramatizations are not evidence, their impact on public memory was significant. They blurred the line between documentary record and fictionalized storytelling. Viewers who encountered the case first through a dramatization often assumed the details had direct evidential basis, when in fact they were amalgams or inventions. Yet factual accounts persisted alongside dramatizations. Guy Lyon Playfair's book This House is Haunted remained in print for decades, continually rediscovered by new readers. Skeptical rebuttals, notably those by Joe Nickell, circulated in parallel. Together they ensured that the factual record remained accessible, even as dramatizations sometimes obscured it. The continuing publication of both believer and skeptic perspectives meant that the Enfield case became a touchstone example in the study of contested evidence. Later interviews with Janet Hodgson demonstrate the ambivalence of retrospective memory. She frequently emphasized that although she admitted to playing tricks on occasion, she could not explain many of the phenomena. This insistence carried weight for journalists because it allowed headlines to highlight both confession and mystery. For researchers, however, it reinforced the problem. Once fabrication is admitted, establishing the reliability of the remaining evidence becomes methodologically impossible. The press's return to Enfield in the 2010s coincided with broader cultural fascination with haunting stories, spurred by popular films and television. This renewed attention often foregrounded the case's status as Britain's most famous, while summarizing the key factual points: the police officer's statement, the SPR involvement, the voice recordings, before moving quickly to emotional testimonies from surviving participants. The effect was to confirm the case's significance while leaving interpretive questions open. One striking feature of these later retellings is the degree to which skepticism has become integrated into the standard narrative rather than presented as a separate counterpoint. In the 1970s, skeptics were often portrayed as debunkers opposing a dominant story. By the 2010s, skeptical commentary was part of the expected structure of any retrospective piece. Documentaries now routinely included interviews with psychologists, vocal experts, or stage magicians, not as dissenting voices but as integral to the narrative. This evolution shows how the cultural framing of the case shifted over time, reflecting wider changes in journalism and broadcasting. Ultimately, the retrospective phase of the Enfield case is as important as the original disturbances. Without the continued representations, the case might have faded into obscurity alongside countless other local stories of unexplained household events. Instead, through a cycle of anniversaries, documentaries, interviews, and dramatizations, it remained alive in public discourse. This persistence was less about new evidence and more about the enduring fascination with the ambiguity of the existing record. The photographs, tapes, and testimonies had been available since the 1970s. What changed was the cultural appetite for revisiting them. By the time of the 40th anniversary in 2017, the Enfield Poltergeist had become both a case study and a cultural symbol. For researchers, it remained a test of how evidence should be evaluated. For skeptics, it served as a classic example of how ordinary events can be misinterpreted. For the media, it was a reliable source of compelling stories. And for the Hodgson family, it was an enduring chapter of personal history that could never fully be left behind. The retrospective phase demonstrates that the significance of Enfield lies not only in what happened in 1977, but in how those events have been remembered, contested, and retold ever since. By the time the Enfield disturbances reached their quieter conclusion in 1979, a set of unresolved issues lingered in the documentary record, issues that investigators, journalists, skeptics, and the family themselves had never fully reconciled. These unresolved discrepancies became the central material of later analysis, not because they promised a definitive solution, but because they revealed the difficulty of disentangling testimony, perception, and documentation in a crowded and highly publicized environment. Phase 9 concerns these enduring contradictions, the points where accounts diverged, the technical records failed to align, and the very reliability of the evidence remained contested. One of the most prominent discrepancies concerned the testimony of law enforcement. Constable Carolyn Heaps, who visited the Hodgson home on September 10, 1977, provided a written report noting that she saw a chair move about 3 to 4 feet across the floor unassisted. This statement, coming from a trained observer, was widely cited by journalists as proof that something unusual had occurred. Yet skeptics pointed out that the description lacked precise context. The lighting in the room, the angle of observation, and the behavior of the children at that moment were not specified. Critics also emphasized that Heaps never claimed supernatural involvement, only that she saw the chair move. The absence of corroborating physical evidence, such as scratches on the floor or repeated demonstrations under controlled conditions, left the testimony both striking and limited. To believers, it remained a cornerstone. To skeptics, it was a report of an unexplained but not necessarily inexplicable perception. Another unresolved tension lay in the photographic evidence. Graham Morris's images of Janet Hodgson airborne circulated globally and were reproduced in newspapers and documentaries for decades. Supporters argued that the photographs captured moments of levitation. Critics countered that they showed only a child mid-jump. The discrepancy was not about the images themselves. They are clear and undisputed, but about how to interpret them. Without accompanying film footage or continuous sequences, it was impossible to establish whether the movements were extraordinary or mundane. Morris himself later leaned toward the view that ordinary explanations sufficed, but his photographs had already taken on symbolic value, creating a gap between the photographer's personal interpretation and the public's perception of his work. The audio recordings introduced their own contradictions. The so-called poltergeist voices, produced primarily by Janet, were recorded for hours and even examined by speech experts. To investigators Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, the recordings suggested something extraordinary: a child sustaining a harsh, low register for long stretches without apparent strain. To vocal experts and skeptics, the same recordings were evidence of false vocal fold phonation, a known though unusual ability. Here again, the material was not disputed. The tapes exist and can be played, but their meaning remains unresolved. Believers and skeptics listened to identical recordings and drew diametrically opposed conclusions. The admissions of trickery by the Hodgson children created another enduring inconsistency. Janet and Margaret both acknowledged, in later interviews and at times even during the investigation, that they sometimes faked incidents. Their explanations varied. They claimed to be testing the investigators, relieving pressure, or responding to the constant demand for phenomena. For skeptics, these admissions cast doubt on the entire record. Once fabrication is admitted, it becomes impossible to know where trickery stopped and unexplained events began. For supporters, the admissions paradoxically strengthened the case. If the children were willing to confess to fakery, why not dismiss the entire affair? Their insistence that much of what happened remained genuine suggested sincerity, at least in part. This contradiction has never been resolved and continues to shape how the case is framed. The investigators themselves disagreed internally. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair remained convinced that the bulk of the phenomena were genuine. Within the Society for Psychical Research, however, colleagues such as Anita Gregory criticized their methods as lacking rigor and too dependent on close personal involvement with the family. This split within the same organization meant that the official record carried conflicting interpretations from the start. The SPR archives contain detailed notes supporting both perspectives, but no consensus statement ever emerged. As a result, the case continues to embody the difficulty of adjudicating evidence when even professional investigators cannot agree on its meaning. Equipment malfunctions added another unresolved dimension. Grosse and Playfair described tape recorders that failed, cameras that misfired, and sudden interruptions of power during key moments. To them, these glitches seemed part of the phenomena. To technical commentators, they were simply the result of overused 1970s recording technology. Without controlled tests, it was impossible to separate ordinary mechanical failure from potentially unusual interference. The discrepancy persisted because both explanations were plausible within their respective frameworks. Discrepancies also existed in witness recollections. Neighbors reported seeing objects fly or hearing knocks through the walls, but their accounts differed in detail. Some recalled dramatic events, while others remembered only minor disturbances. The Hodgson family themselves gave varying descriptions over time, with Janet in particular emphasizing different aspects depending on the interviewer. These inconsistencies reflect the natural variability of memory under stress, but also complicate efforts to construct a coherent timeline. The role of the media introduced further contradictions. Journalists wanted compelling stories, and editors selected the most dramatic photographs and quotations. As a result, the public record overrepresented certain moments, Janet airborne, the gravelly voices, while underrepresenting long stretches of uneventful observation. This imbalance left later analysts with a skewed record. The spectacular survived, the ordinary faded. The contradiction here lies between the daily logs kept by investigators, which often record hours of silence or mundane family life, and the condensed media version that highlighted only extraordinary moments. Finally, the long retrospective phase created its own unresolved discrepancies. Later dramatizations blurred fact and fiction, sometimes inventing details for narrative effect. Audiences who encountered the story through dramatized versions often assumed those details were factual, while factual accounts remained contested. This layering of interpretations means that even today, distinguishing between primary testimony, investigator records, skeptical analysis, and dramatization requires careful disentanglement. In the end, the unresolved contradictions of the Enfield case form part of its enduring appeal. It is not that the evidence is uniquely strong. Rather, it is uniquely contested. Police statements, photographs, tapes, admissions of trickery, internal disputes among investigators, technical glitches, and retrospective dramatizations all coexist without reconciliation. Each element is real in the sense of existing in the record, but their meanings diverge according to the perspective of the interpreter. The Enfield disturbances therefore remain not a solved case, but a case study in how evidence can remain perpetually suspended between belief and doubt. By the early 1980s, when the Hodgson family's home had returned to relative normality, researchers and commentators were already framing Enfield as a landmark. Within the Society for Psychical Research, it became a major case study, discussed in conferences and cited in journals. Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair's continued advocacy ensured that the material they had gathered, tapes, logs, and photographs, remained in circulation. Their commitment to the case made it central in psychical research discussions, where it was often presented as one of the most fully documented investigations of its kind. At the same time, the internal criticisms of Anita Gregory and others ensured that the case was remembered not only as evidence but also as a cautionary tale about methodological shortcomings. Outside the SPR, skeptics kept the debate alive. Joe Nichols' analyses in Skeptical Inquirer became reference points, reprinted and cited in skeptical literature worldwide. The Enfield case was used to demonstrate how ambiguous evidence, photographs of airborne children, audio recordings of strange voices, could be understood without invoking extraordinary explanations. The skeptical legacy was not confined to pointing out errors. It also highlighted the importance of controls, independent verification, and critical distance. In academic settings, particularly in psychology and sociology, Enfield became a case study in how group dynamics, suggestion, and expectation can shape experiences. For the Hodgson family, the legacy was more personal. Janet and Margaret carried the burden of their adolescent experiences into adulthood. Interviews decades later revealed ambivalence. They acknowledged the impact of fame, the pressure of constant observation, and the strain of having their household turned into a public stage. Janet's repeated statements that not everything was faked illustrate the lasting complexity of her position. She could not deny that she and her sister staged incidents at times, but she also resisted the idea that the entire case was fabricated. This tension became part of the story itself, with journalists highlighting it as evidence of enduring mystery. The cultural afterlife of Enfield took shape most vividly in media adaptations. Documentaries in the 1990s and 2000s revisited the case, often with dramatic reconstructions intercut with archival footage and new interviews. Each generation of documentary filmmakers returned to the same set of materials: Morris's photographs, Gross's tapes, the police statement, and the Hodgson sisters' recollections. With each retelling, the images and sounds gained a new audience, ensuring the case's continued visibility. In the 2010s, dramatizations brought Enfield to a global audience. The Sky Living/ITV miniseries The Enfield Haunting, 2015, adapted from Playfair's book, presented a fictionalized version of events, blending documented material with dramatic invention. Soon after, the Hollywood film The Conjuring 2, 2016, incorporated a highly fictionalized Enfield subplot into a larger franchise narrative. These dramatizations introduced millions of viewers worldwide to the name Enfield Poltergeist, though often in ways far removed from the documented record. The result was a paradoxical legacy. Enfield became more famous than ever, yet its historical details were increasingly obscured by fictional embellishment. Academically, Enfield has been cited in studies of mass media, folklore, and the sociology of belief. Scholars such as David Clark have examined how stories of hauntings operate as contemporary folklore, shaped by media circulation and collective interpretation rather than by their factual basis alone. From this perspective, Enfield is significant less as a test of paranormal claims and more as an example of how extraordinary narratives spread and persist. The interplay of official police reports, journalistic photographs, and children's testimony provided a uniquely rich seedbed for folkloric growth. The legacy also extends to how Enfield influenced later cases. Investigators and journalists often compared new reports of household disturbances to Enfield, treating it as a benchmark. For skeptics, the comparison was a way of emphasizing the pitfalls of overinterpretation. For psychical researchers, it remained a reference point for the scale of documentation they hoped to achieve. The Enfield case set a standard in both supportive and critical literature. It was simultaneously the best documented poltergeist case and the best example of how ambiguous evidence could mislead. For the broader public, Enfield's endurance stems from its unresolved quality. Unlike cases where evidence was quickly discredited or convincingly explained, Enfield remained suspended in ambiguity. Police statements, photographs, and tapes could not be dismissed outright, yet none proved conclusive. Admissions of trickery muddied the water rather than clarifying it. This unresolved status made the case adaptable. It could be cited by believers as compelling evidence, by skeptics as a classic debunking, and by dramatists as fertile ground for storytelling. The digital age further extended Enfield's reach. Archival photographs, once accessible only in newspapers or books, circulated widely online. Audio recordings of the voices, digitized and shared on video platforms, reached global audiences who could evaluate them firsthand. Blogs, podcasts, and online forums revisited the case, often blending archival material with commentary. This democratization of access reinforced Enfield's place as an ongoing topic of debate rather than a closed historical episode. Yet, for all its cultural prominence, the unresolved contradictions at the heart of Enfield remain the defining feature of its legacy. Was the police officer's testimony a reliable observation of something unexplained, or a misperception under stressful conditions? Were the photographs proof of levitation or evidence of children at play? Were the voices anomalous phenomena or vocal tricks? The fact that decades of scrutiny have not produced consensus is precisely why Enfield endures. It is not a solved case but an open one, continually reinterpreted as new generations encounter the same ambiguous materials. In the end, the legacy of Enfield is twofold. It is a historical episode tied to a particular family in a working-class suburb of London in the late 1970s. But it is also a cultural phenomenon, continually reshaped by media, scholarship, and popular imagination. Its endurance does not lie in the strength of its evidence, but in the persistence of its ambiguity. That unresolved quality ensures that Enfield remains, more than 4 decades later, not only Britain's most famous household disturbance, but also one of its most enduring cultural narratives. The Enfield disturbances began with the ordinary life of a working-class family, suddenly punctuated by sounds and movements that they did not understand. Police officers, journalists, and neighbors became early witnesses, providing documentation that gave the case unusual traction from the start. The police constable's signed statement about a chair moving was factually recorded, though its meaning was debated. Journalists from the Daily Mirror and later the BBC entered the home, producing photographs, articles, and broadcasts that transformed private confusion into public narrative. Graham Morris's images of Janet Airborne and Douglas Bence's reports brought national attention to what might otherwise have remained a neighborhood story. Into this atmosphere stepped Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair of the Society for Psychical Research. Their involvement was the most sustained, resulting in hundreds of hours of tape recordings, notebooks filled with logged events, and later publications. Their proximity to the family gave them access, but also exposed them to criticisms of bias and lack of control. Supporters saw them as dedicated investigators. Critics saw them as too personally invested. Their work became both the backbone of the Enfield record and the subject of its deepest disputes. The Hodgson children, especially Janet, were central throughout. Their voices were recorded, their images photographed, their behavior scrutinized. They admitted to faking some incidents, while insisting that much else was genuine. This dual stance created one of the most enduring contradictions in the case. If some events were fabricated, how could anyone determine which were not? For researchers, this ambiguity was frustrating. For skeptics, it was decisive evidence against reliability. For journalists, it was the perfect ingredient for keeping the story alive. Skeptics such as Joe Nickell dissected the evidence from a technical perspective. To them, the photographs showed jumps, not levitation. The voices were consistent with vocal fold techniques, not external entities. Tape malfunctions were the result of overused machines, not unexplained interference. Their arguments drew on expertise in photography, audio technology, and stagecraft, and provided naturalistic frameworks for each piece of evidence. Professor Chris French and others added psychological analysis, suggesting that expectation, attention, and group dynamics could account for much of the testimony. The skeptical legacy ensured that Enfield became as famous for debunking as for belief. Meanwhile, the Society for Psychical Research itself reflected the split. Gross and Playfair argued that the accumulation of incidents pointed to something extraordinary. Anita Gregory and John Beloff, among others, cautioned that the conditions were uncontrolled, the witnesses unreliable, and the investigators too entangled with the family. The lack of consensus within the SPR meant that Enfield was never endorsed officially as proof of anything beyond the ordinary. Instead, it became a case study in how difficult it is to establish controlled evidence in lived domestic settings. As years passed, Enfield entered a second life through retrospection. Anniversaries brought newspaper features, documentaries, and reunion broadcasts. The BBC's 2018 program brought together Morris and the Hodgson sisters, allowing participants to reflect on what had happened and how it shaped them. Janet reiterated that much had been genuine, even if tricks had been played. Morris reaffirmed his skepticism but acknowledged the drama of the experience. These retrospective voices highlighted how memory, interpretation, and experience had fused into a cultural story. The dramatizations of the 2010s, such as The Enfield Haunting, 2015, and The Conjuring 2, 2016, introduced the story to global audiences. These versions blended fact with fiction, often exaggerating or inventing elements. While they obscured historical accuracy, they reinforced the case's iconic status. Audiences unfamiliar with the SPR or skeptical literature came to know Enfield as a cinematic haunting, demonstrating how cultural retellings can reshape public memory. Digitization in the 21st century allowed archival materials to circulate widely. Photographs and audio tapes once accessible only to researchers became available online, enabling new audiences to assess them directly. Podcasts and blogs revisited the case, often citing both believer and skeptic sources. The Enfield disturbances thus transitioned from a local British story to a globally accessible case study in contested evidence. The enduring legacy lies in the contradictions that were never resolved. A police officer's testimony is on record but cannot be verified beyond her statement. Photographs are clear but ambiguous in interpretation. Audio recordings exist but divide experts over their significance. Children admitted trickery yet insisted on authenticity. Investigators defended the genuineness of events while colleagues questioned their methods. Media amplified dramatic episodes while ignoring long stretches of silence. Retrospectives repeated the same materials, ensuring their survival but also their mythologization. What remains is not proof of the extraordinary, nor proof of fraud alone, but an enduring example of how evidence, testimony, and interpretation can resist resolution. Enfield's place in history comes not from solving the mystery but from its insolubility. It has become Britain's most famous household disturbance precisely because it embodies the difficulty of distinguishing perception from fact, memory from documentation, and reportage from dramatization. For scholars, Enfield remains a case study in contested evidence. For skeptics, it is a textbook example of misinterpretation and fabrication. For believers, It is an archive of testimony that suggests something beyond the ordinary. For journalists and dramatists, it is an inexhaustible source of story. For the Hodgson family, it is an indelible chapter of personal history, shaping their adolescence and following them into adulthood. Thus, the Enfield case concludes not with certainty but with persistence. It continues to be retold, re-examined, and reinterpreted decades after the last disturbances ceased. Its power lies in its ambiguity, its ability to sustain multiple readings without collapsing into consensus. That ambiguity ensures that Enfield will remain a point of reference, debate, and fascination for as long as people are interested in the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary. From a historiographical perspective, Enfield occupies a unique place in the archive of so-called poltergeist cases. Unlike 19th and early 20th century reports, which often relied on limited newspaper articles or hearsay, Enfield was documented across multiple platforms. Police paperwork, press photography, audio tapes, and interviews on radio and television. The volume and diversity of this record gave the case an unusual durability. Where earlier hauntings often faded due to lack of documentation, Enfield survived because there was always something tangible to return to: a photograph, a signed police report, or a tape recording. This material, while ambiguous, provided enough of a foothold to keep the case alive in scholarly and skeptical circles alike. The handling of these materials illustrates how different interpretive communities construct meaning. For psychical researchers such as Maurice Grosse and Guy Lyon Playfair, the accumulation of anomalies suggested a case that merited deep attention. Their decision to log incidents in real time and to spend nights in the house reflects a research methodology rooted in proximity. Yet this very proximity created vulnerabilities. Their credibility was undermined by critics who argued that such immersion blurred objectivity. The Society for Psychical Research's mixed response, allowing Grosse and Playfair to present findings while simultaneously circulating critiques from Anita Gregory and John Beloff, shows how Enfield forced even dedicated research organizations to wrestle with internal standards of evidence. Skeptics, conversely, treated the same materials as case studies in error. Joe Nichols' breakdown of the photographic evidence and voice phenomena emphasized mechanical and behavioral explanations. For skeptics, the fact that the Hodgson children admitted staging incidents was decisive. It tainted the evidentiary base to the point that the entire case could be dismissed as unreliable. In this view, Enfield was not proof of the extraordinary but proof of how easily researchers could be misled. This interpretation found traction in skeptical literature worldwide, ensuring that Enfield was cited not as a breakthrough but as a cautionary tale. The Hodgson family, whose home became the site of global attention, continued to play a central role in shaping the legacy. Janet Hodgson, in particular, gave interviews well into adulthood, stressing that while trickery occurred, many events had not been fabricated. These retrospective statements perpetuated ambiguity rather than resolving it. For believers, her insistence preserved the possibility of authenticity. For skeptics, her admissions reinforced their dismissal. The persistence of this duality illustrates how memory, narrative, and identity became intertwined. For Janet, the case was both a personal history and a public role she could not entirely disavow. Media treatment of Enfield over time demonstrates the power of framing. Early newspaper reports emphasized shock and spectacle, often leading with dramatic images of airborne children or sensational claims. Later documentaries introduced a more balanced tone, juxtaposing skeptics with believers and framing the case as an enduring mystery rather than a resolved phenomenon. The dramatizations of the 2010s, such as The Enfield Haunting and The Conjuring 2, prioritized emotional resonance and cinematic storytelling over historical accuracy. These dramatizations ensured the case's global fame, but at the cost of conflating documented history with fictional invention. What entered the popular imagination was no longer the Hodgson's testimony or Grosse's tapes, but stylized versions of events designed for entertainment. From a folkloristic standpoint, Enfield can be seen as an instance of modern myth-making. Like older legends of haunted houses, the case circulated in retellings that adapted to audience expectations. The ingredients, children, a working-class setting, official witnesses, ambiguous photographs, provided a narrative structure that could be endlessly reshaped. Scholars of folklore have noted that Enfield functions less as a set of verifiable facts and more as a story template, adaptable to dramatizations, documentaries, and debates. In this sense, its factual ambiguities are not weaknesses but essential features, enabling the story to travel and persist. In the digital era, the archive of Enfield has become accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The circulation of Morse's photographs, digitized audio tapes, and scans of original newspaper articles means that researchers, enthusiasts, and casual browsers alike can engage with the primary record. This democratization has extended the case's life, ensuring that each new wave of readers and viewers can form their own conclusions. Online debates on forums, podcasts, and blogs continue to replay the arguments of the 1970s and 1980s, demonstrating the case's enduring capacity to spark discussion. At the level of cultural memory, Enfield has become shorthand for an unresolved haunting. Its significance lies not in proving or disproving the paranormal, but in exemplifying the difficulty of adjudicating ambiguous evidence. Every piece of documentation is simultaneously solid because it exists and unstable because its meaning is contested. A signed police statement confirms that an officer saw a chair move but does not explain how. A photograph shows a child airborne but does not resolve whether she jumped or levitated. A tape records a strange voice but cannot prove its origin. These fragments resist closure, creating a narrative that remains perpetually open. And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. If you enjoyed this journey into the unexplained, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss what's next. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. This is Eternal Obsidian, signing off until we meet again in the shadows.